Hey, how's it going? It's Grant with the Garden of Eder, and in this video, I'll show you how to grow tanks packed full of moss, simple, and with very minimal maintenance. To start off, you're gonna need a good light if you want tanks that look like this. We highly recommend getting a full spectrum LED light. You can get a cheap and efficient one off of eBay or Amazon. We recommend either Beamworks or Aquatic. We have been using both of these brands of lights for many years now, and they work great for our little shrimp tanks. Now the next most important thing, or possibly even the most important thing, is gonna be your water changes. You have to stay on top of this if you want thick, green, luscious moss that is algae free. For us, we recommend doing 20 to 25% water changes every week, or 50% water changes every other week. For us, this has been keeping all of the algae away, as well as giving us maximum growth across all of our tanks with all of the different types of moss that we grow. Now for fertilizers, we don't use any for the tanks inside or the tanks outside. I just don't have any needs. For the tanks inside, we use RO water with a remineralizer, Brightwell GH+, and we don't really add anything else to the water besides maybe some black water extract. But however, the soil that we use, the Florin Volcanic Brightwell Aqua Soil, is jam-packed with nutrients, and every time we do a water change, it just keeps those nutrients down to a level that the moss is able to consume and not have to compete with the algae or anything like that, and is able to just grow nice and lush without the use of any fertilizer. For our tanks outside, we also don't use any CO2 or fertilizer. And the reason for that is there's more readily available CO2 outside, so those tanks get a lot more than the tanks inside. Also, there isn't any aqua soil in the tanks outside. However, we do overfeed quite a bit more, and they are getting a lot more sun and light outside than they are in the tanks inside. Now, we have been trying many different methods of growing moss, and we have found that for the majority of the types of moss that we have, just tossing the moss in the tank free floating so they can kind of spin around on their own allows them to turn and get light on different sides and grow out in all directions until it is taken to your tank, and then it can really start to thrive. We've tried attaching it to wood and it has some success. However, with other tanks it doesn't grow that well until it breaks off the wood and then really starts to take off. Same with rock, really haven't had that much success growing any of the moss on rock that's just really thriving and growing out. We are able to grow nice thick batches of moss over the rock, but it really needs some nice pruning and trimming to keep that algae back. So for us, just throwing it in the tank rather than attaching it to stainless steel mesh or anything like that with super glue or rubber bands or fishing line, this has been the best method for us. And as you can see, it just kind of takes over our tanks very slowly, but within 6 months I'm able to grow just about all the type of moss that we have except for the mini pelly, a whole 10-gallon tank full in 6 months. And there really is so many different types of mosses. The Christmas moss, Taiwan moss, they both just thrive in the tank so well. However, the Christmas moss kind of stays bunched up and doesn't really attach to anything, where the Taiwan moss, whatever it can cling on to, it will just grab onto and climb and grow straight up and out of the tank if you allow it to. And then we have other plants in the hobby, like mini pelly, subwasser tang, or red moss, that aren't really mosses. However, they're considered moss throughout the whole hobby, but they're actually an algae. I used to try really hard to grow a lot of different types of mosses, like a different type of moss in every single one of my tanks, and I eventually found that the moss that worked the best for me was the Christmas moss. It just seems to thrive without any attention to it. But before, I used to try really hard to do the stainless steel mesh and wrap all the mesh down, tie it down, and use fertilizers and anything I really could to try and get a jump on growing the moss. And all I really ever did was grow a lot of hair algae. I grew moss, but it just seemed like the hair algae grew twice as fast and it just was not controllable. So for that reason, I don't use any fertilizers when trying to grow my moss, especially with the overfeeding with the neos and the aqua soil with the caridina. I just don't think it's needed if you're trying to grow tanks like this. Because all of my tanks inside are shrimp tanks, I don't have any tanks that are dedicated to aquascaping or just growing plants. I don't use any CO2. Of course, CO2 would help make everything more dense and thicker, but it isn't needed if you're really trying to just grow out the moss. There is no room for the shrimp to crawl around in this tank at all. I can't imagine the CO2 making it grow any bigger. All it would do is grow nice, thicker, more dense fronds. So like I mentioned before, battling algae is the biggest issue I have when trying to grow moss. I have picked up a couple tricks over the years. My number one trick is, especially with my racks where I have multiple tanks on the same row and I have the same light going across several tanks, I can't just reduce the time of that light or raise the light. I have to find a way to just take care of that tank, and I find just placing a small towel over that tank will reduce the light enough that the moss will still thrive and the algae will die off. But you must maintain proper water changes in order for that to happen, or else the algae won't die off. And like I said, if you don't have a rack with multiple tanks in the same row, or if you do and you have multiple lights, what you need to do is reduce the amount of time you have your lights on. We run all of our tanks, or try to run all of our tanks, at about 8 hours a day. If you've got algae issues, you need to reduce your time. Plants will still do great with just 6 hours of light every day. Also, another thing you can do is raise the lights up. Sometimes the lights are just too close, they're just too intense for the moss, and a lot of times people like to put the moss on ledges. You can also lower the moss ledge down. That will also help to reduce the algae. And if you haven't already, and you're doing the 25% every week or 50% every other week with your water changes, and you still have algae issues, you can always increase and do more percentage and then decrease the amount of time in between your water changes. This will help you have cleaner water, and with cleaner water, the algae will not have anything to eat and thrive on. And if you're having to do that many water changes, chances are you're overfeeding. For some breeders, this is not possible to do, so you're gonna have to just do everything else extra to keep that water as pristine as possible. Another thing you need to keep in mind is natural light. A lot of people run their tanks for 8 hours a day, but don't realize that the light in the kitchen or living room, wherever the tank is also producing light, creating photosynthesis within the tank. However, it's not intense light, it's still creating the process to go on, which is also putting the algae through the same thing. And then also, there's several algae that can be taken care of with H2O2. The red moss is technically an algae. If it got all over your tank and created havoc and you didn't want it in your tank, a simple dose of H2O2 or hydrogen peroxide would kill it off. It'll go from red to orange and eventually just disappear. It's kind of similar to like blackbeard algae, where it'll go from like purple to pink, white, and just kind of die off. H2O2 can help with blackbeard algae, however, it's not a for sure thing. Sometimes you may need multiple treatments. Blackbeard algae thrives in high flow, so if you're having moss in a high flow area and you have blackbeard algae, chances are you're going to want to change up your flow and trim off any of the blackbeard algae as possible. Trimming and manual removal of any algae is the best and fastest way to get rid of any algae in your tank. If you're going to be lazy, it's going to take longer. You can always get rid of algae with proper maintenance of water changes and feeding and the right light schedule. However, if you're in a pinch and you want to get it done as fast as possible, trimming and manual removal will be your fastest way. So thanks for watching, guys. That'll be all for this video. Hopefully that helps you guys grow very nice and thick, lush tanks of moss just like this. We'll see you next time.